If I had a nickel for every time an early English colony in North America got off to an absolutely disastrous start, I would actually have 3 nickels, and that surprised me because I was only aware of 2 of them. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Line. In 1590, Captain James White arrived in the Outer Banks with a group of settlers and ships laden with supplies, only to find that the colony he had left behind 3 years earlier had mysteriously vanished. Left behind were the ghostly remains of the settlement at Roanoke, the only sign of their fate being the hastily carved word Croatoan. Nearly 2 decades later, a second colony just inside the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay was nearly abandoned after its starving inhabitants were forced to resort to cannibalism just to stay alive. While Jamestown would go on to survive, its early years were a desperate struggle marked by starvation and war. These 2 disastrous attempts at early British settlement of the Americas are very well known, but few have heard the story of Britain's ill-fated third attempt at colonizing the mainland. Most Americans are familiar with some version of the story of the Plymouth colony, founded in the 1620s by Puritan separatists seeking to escape a reformation that they deemed not Protestant enough. The Mayflower, however, was not the first ship to ferry settlers across the Atlantic and onto the coasts of New England. In fact, its journey wasn't even the second voyage intended for this purpose, it was the third and potentially even the fourth. 4 months before Captain Christopher Newport and his fleet left for the Chesapeake in December of 1606, another ship was already underway towards what is now the U.S. state of Maine. It was called the Richard, and it was bound for the Sagadahoc River until the Spanish intercepted it and captured it off the coast of Florida in November of that same year. Now, was it supposed to be anywhere near Florida? No, but the English weren't very good at this yet. But not to be denied his New England colony, the voyage's primary financier, Sir John Popham, the Lord Chief Justice of England, organized a second attempt at establishing a colony at the mouth of the Sagadahoc, and in June of 1607, his ship set sail. These 2 ships, the Gift of God and the Marian John, would succeed in making their way to the Maine coastline. There, they would brave hurricanes, face the untamed Maine wilderness, and encounter the inhabitants of pre-colonial New England, the Abenaki. But just a year after they made landfall, they would pack up and return to England. Yet another example of the difficulty and danger inherent in the settlement of this strange new world, the Popham colony faded into the annals of history, and for nearly 3 centuries, even its exact location was lost to time. This is the story of America's forgotten colony, and in my opinion, it is one of the greatest adventure stories never told. And speaking of things that are forgotten, let's not forget to thank today's sponsor, Ghost VPN. With over 38 million users worldwide, CyberGhost is one of the most popular VPN providers on the market, with a near-perfect score on Trustpilot. If you're not familiar with the concept of VPNs, they're essential applications when it comes to protecting your digital privacy. And if you think you're already covered because you only browse in incognito mode, well, think again. Plenty of eyes are watching you every time you go online, and incognito mode really only gives you a false sense of security. Your internet service provider, your school or work's IT department, your own Wi-Fi router, and even the websites you visit still know who you are, and they track your every move. CyberGhost VPN helps put a stop to all that data harvesting. Just turn it on before you browse, and it'll encrypt and reroute 100% of your traffic through their secure servers, so your online activity remains private and protected. Not only that, but CyberGhost has servers in over 100 countries, meaning you can change your location and unblock region-locked content from streaming platforms like Netflix, Amazon Prime, and many more. CyberGhost is available for all operating systems and can protect up to 7 devices at the same time, keeping your anonymity around the clock and allowing you to share your subscription with friends and family. And what's more, CyberGhost VPN doesn't keep logs, so not even they know what you do online. So if you'd like to keep prying eyes at bay and stay anonymous online, now is the perfect time to get CyberGhost VPN. And by using the link in the description, you benefit from an 84% discount and 4 months free. They also have a 45-day money-back guarantee and access to 24/7 customer support, so everything about the product is risk-free. If you'd like to get started, go ahead and use the link in the description to get CyberGhost VPN and start protecting your digital life today. George Popham was by trade a soldier, yet by name he was a nobleman and the nephew of one of the most powerful men in England. For this reason, and one would also hope a degree of merit, the middle-aged Popham found himself appointed the captain of the Gift of God and the first president of the Plymouth colony's intended settlement on the Sagadahoc, now known as the Kennebec River. Second in command and captain of the Mary and John was 25-year-old Raleigh Gilbert, the son of Sir Humphrey Gilbert and nephew of Sir Walter Raleigh, the patron of the failed colony at Roanoke. Young, arrogant, and headstrong, Gilbert was quite the opposite in temperament to his commanding officer, and more interested in exploration and gallantry than administration. While this clash of personalities would cause issues later on, the voyage from Plymouth, England to their intended destination went about as smoothly as any overseas expedition of the 17th century could. According to James Davies, master of the Mary and John, the voyage left England from the Cornish Peninsula on June 1, 1607, intending to restock water and wood at Ilha des Flores in the Azores before heading west towards the New World. An early sign of Gilbert's arrogance showed as they came to the archipelago, as the crew sighted Graciosa on the 25th of that same month. Gilbert, however, was convinced that this island was their destination, and it was only thanks to Davies' insistence that they didn't find themselves off course from their very first stop. The ship's master corrected the young aristocrat and the small number of gentlemen accompanying them, and 2 days later they found themselves making landfall on the correct island. But just a couple of days into their stay, Gilbert managed to get himself into trouble when he accepted an invitation to come aboard a Dutch ship, where the captain proceeded to accuse him of being a pirate. After a day's worth of being put through what Davies referred to as most vile and shameful abuses, Gilbert was returned to his ship, and on the 1st of July, the Mary and John made way for Virginia. Unfortunately, by the time Gilbert's vessel was underway, Popham and the Gift of God had already put to sea, either unaware or simply uncaring for the younger captain's misadventure aboard the Dutch ship. This was no trouble for the experienced crew of the smaller vessel, who under Davies' guidance sailed west until they reached the shallow water some distance off of Nova Scotia, potentially near Sable Island. Though they were unable to find a place to land there, the waters teemed with cod such that they managed to catch 200 in just 3 hours of work. And that was enough to raise their spirits, though fresh water was still a concern, and after 3 more days of sailing, they finally sighted an island, which stands in the latitude of 44 1/3 degrees, believed to be Cape LaHave Island. And if that is Cape LaHave, I apologize, feel free to correct me in the comments. I am a simple man from Pennsylvania. Make fun of me all you like, but I challenge you to pronounce the names of literally any of our major rivers. Anyway, it was here at Cape LaHave or Cape LaHave, or however you people pronounce it up there, that the Englishmen first encountered the East Algonquian Mi'kmaq people, who approached them in a small boat, described by Davies as a biskin shallop. And I also get boat terminology wrong all the time, but Thornbury hasn't corrected me, so I'm thinking I got that one right.
What did you say?
Biskin shallop.
Honestly, that's totally unfamiliar to me, so...
Or it's totally unfamiliar to him, and we're both going to get mocked in the comments. Anyway, you have at us. They came near unto us and spoke unto us in their language, the sailor wrote, and we, making signs to them that they should come aboard of us, showing unto them knives, glasses, and beads, and throwing into their boat some biscuit, but for all of this they would not come aboard. Yes, that is how it was written. Grammar worked a little differently back in the olden days. But despite these offers of gifts, the natives instead retreated from the English ship, only to turn around and come back once they perceived that they were in no danger. Davies wrote that 3 of the 8 men aboard the shallop came on board his ship, and even stayed the night with them, at which point the English were somewhat surprised to learn that their guests spoke some French. According to the editor of Davies' work, Reverend B.F. DaCosta, this was in fact a known trading point between the French and the natives, which explains how they acquired the Basque-style sailboats the author referred to as biskin shallops. In the morning, the same natives from the prior day returned with a boat full of beaver furs, seeking to trade with their new English acquaintances and retrieve their companions. And it would seem that during this exchange, the crew of the Mary and John learned that the chief commander of these parts was called Messamot. According to Mi'kmaq historian and elder Daniel N. Paul, this man, also known to the French by his baptismal name of Henri Membertou, was the district chief of, and I'm going to try my best here, Kesputwik, I think, and had been appointed by his peers from the 6 other Mi'kmaq districts as the Grand Chief, or, in their tongue, Sagamo. Now, this was not a position of hereditary authority like the English monarchy, but rather an elected position more akin to the practices of the Celtic nations of Europe, like an elected high king who presided over a group of related tribes. French explorer Marc Lescarbot described his powers as lacking the supreme authority of a European king, but as sufficient to harangue, advise, and lead his people to war, or to render justice to one who has a grievance, and like matters. It made sense that Membertou had been raised to this position as Sagamore, too, because he must have been one of the wisest men to ever live amongst the Mi'kmaq. If he and his people were to be believed, Membertou was over 100 years old by the time of the English arrival in the area, and he had been present when Jacques Cartier explored the area in 1534. Just to be clear here, this man was an adult in 1534, and he was still alive and leading his people in 1607. He was also described as being a rare man amongst his people for other reasons, those being that he was taller and stronger than most of the other men of his tribe, and that he wore a beard and showed few signs of his advanced age. Davies, of course, knew none of this, but what he did know was that his crew was being treated very well by their new acquaintances, who seemed to have taken no issue with their landing several hours later. No man of the crew, so far as his work suggests, had ever set foot in North America before, and what they found there astonished them. The trees were tall and ancient, with abundant berry bushes covering the small islands off the coast of Nova Scotia. The water was clean, the air aromatic, and the inhabitants friendly, and it must have seemed a paradise to those coming from the crowded cities of England. It was kind of unfortunate that this wasn't their destination, and on the 3rd of August, they set sail west under the guidance of a native man named Skidwaries. Part of the problem with the pronunciation on this one is that this is a very niche story, and there's not a ton of scholarship on it. I have no idea how I'm supposed to pronounce these terms. I think it's Skidwaries. We're gonna go with Skidwaries. Anyway, Skidwaries was the man who led them across the Bay of Fundy and towards the Sagadahoc River. For days, they sailed along the coasts, passing from Mi'kmaq territory into the lands of the Penobscot, and then towards those of the Abenaki, noting the high mountains near modern-day Camden, Maine, as they went. On the 6th, they found themselves coming upon George's Islands, and it was as they made it to the isles that they descried a sail standing in towards them. It was the gift of God, and on August 7th, 1607, the two ships were reunited at last. Ever in search of glory and riches, 25-year-old Raleigh Gilbert did not wait for his expedition's leader to join him before putting ashore with a small company of men. The gift of the God and the Mary and John had, at long last, more than 2 months since losing one another, rendezvoused at what they called St. George's Island, known today as Allen Island. They had been anchored off the coast for just 1 day, but Gilbert was in no mood to sit around and make plans. Instead, in the dead of night on the same evening, he gathered 13 companions, Davies and the Native American guide included, and they rowed west towards the many large coves which cut into the Maine coastline. Skidwaries directed them into one such body of water, named by the author as the Pemaquid River, and there they landed. Once on land, Gilbert asked to be taken to the nearest village, but found unexpected resistance from his own guide. It would appear that they had come to the same place where Weymouth, another English explorer who passed through the area in 1605, received a hostile reception. DaCosta added in the footnotes of his edition, explaining that this was the resort of at least a portion of the people abducted by that explorer, which kind of explains the hostile reception. It had been Weymouth who identified the Sagadahoc as a sufficient spot for a colony, but in the course of his mission, he had taken, by undescribed means, the very same men who now served as guides. Whatever the details were, Skidwaries was reluctant to bring the Englishmen to the village, but agreed to do so upon Gilbert's insistence that he would not return to his ship until he had spoken with some of them. The guide thus relented, and after a march of about 3 miles, they came to the village of a chief by the name of Nahanata. Though the language used by Davies does not explicitly say as much, he may have been aware that Nahanata also spent time as either a guest or captive of Weymouth, and the welcome they received implied that his station amongst the English was more akin to the latter than the former. At our first sight of them, Davies wrote, upon a howling or a cry that they all made, they all presently issued forth towards us with their bows and arrows. The Englishmen, likely armed with either swords and targes or with matchlock muskets, stood their ground, and the situation may well have ended in a slaughter if not for the intervention of Skidwaries, who interceded on their behalf and explained their presence to Nahanata. There was a tense moment between the battle lines before the chief, as Davies wrote, perceived what we were and caused them all to lay aside their bows and arrows. The two sides lay down their weapons, and as quickly as arms had been raised, approached each other and embraced as friends. There is a sort of immeasurable tragedy in what might have been. Gilbert's men stayed with the Indians for about 2 hours, and their hosts graciously welcomed them into their homes as they communicated through Skidwaries. The details of their discussions sadly went unrecorded, but it would seem that they were on friendly terms when Gilbert's troop returned to their ship on the afternoon of Saturday, August 8th. Playing the role of a faithful second-in-command, Gilbert relayed what had transpired to George Popham, and the commander set about organizing a second visit to the mainland. First, however, they gathered on Allen Island the following day, under a cross they believed was set up by Weymouth 2 years prior. There they held the first Anglican service in New England, though it's unclear if it was a true mass or simply a sermon. And for those interested in the specifics of religious history, Davies did not name the preacher, but William Strachey, the author of History of Travel into Virginia Britannia, referred to him as Mr. Seymour rather than Father Seymour, which would imply that the man was not yet ordained and thus unable to provide a proper Eucharistic service. Whatever the case, the remainder of the 9th was spent at rest, and then on the 10th, Popham led a group of 30 men back to the Pemaquid, this time traveling further upriver in order to land at Nahanada's village and avoid the 3-mile hike through the Maine wilderness. Upon reaching the settlement, however, they found themselves once again greeted with hostility, though this time of a more cautious sort. Nahanada stood at the front of the line, and Skidwaries called out to explain once more that their coming tended to no evil towards himself or any of his people. Nahanada accepted this, but he was a shrewd leader not unaccustomed to the ways of the English. Nahanada not only knew George Weymouth, but had indeed been abducted by him and taken to England in 1605, after which the English had ever so kindly returned him to his homeland, on board Captain Thomas Hannam's ship in 1606. This experience likely informed his decision to restrict the number of Englishmen he allowed to come ashore that day. Popham did not wish to offend his host, so he agreed to limit his party to only 10 or 12 of the chief gentlemen. According to Davies, they had some parley together, and whatever their discussion entailed resulted in the natives allowing the entire English party to land. With that, the English disembarked from their ship and joined the natives to socialize and discuss trade agreements. For a time, all seemed to be going well, but then an imperceptible change came over the gathering. They had been there only an hour or two when, suddenly and without warning, the natives withdrew into the woods, leaving the confused Englishmen standing alone on the shore. Skidwary still stood among them, the sole Indian remaining amongst the Europeans, and the English finally perceived that something was wrong, though what it was no man could really say. They moved to get aboard their shallop, wary of the shift in the air, and it was then that Skidwaries made his move. As the English climbed back aboard their boat, they beckoned for their guide to join them, and though they felt they had treated him with all due kindness, he refused to get back on the boat. Wishing to avoid any violence, and in the spirit of what friendship they believed they had with the man, they didn't argue the matter any further. Instead, they simply set off onto the river, and due to the late hour, crossed to the opposite shore to camp for the night. Davies' writing does not venture to guess what might have turned the gathering. It is possible the English did something to offend their hosts, or it could be that something was spoken in the Abenaki language 2 days prior, and that they narrowly escaped violence against them from the numerically superior natives. We'll likely never know the truth, but it was an omen of things to come. At first light on the 11th, Popham's ship set off down the river and across the water towards their outpost at Allen Island. It was time to make their way to the intended settlement site at the mouth of the Sagadahoc, so they sailed west the following day, and on the 13th they came to the waters south of Sagadahoc Island, not realizing that their destination actually lay several miles north of them. They ended up overshooting the river's entrance by 6 miles, at which point it was too late to turn back around, and thus they spent yet another night at sea, and in a violent storm no less. The wind blew hard, and the men feared that the tempest would blow them onto the rocks to their north and sink them all, but by some miracle they held out till morning, and the dawn light revealed a pair of islands which managed to protect them from the worst of the wind and waves. Still, the storm raged throughout the entirety of the 14th of August, and it's likely that the men were experiencing their first taste of the wonderful summer hurricanes common to the Atlantic seaboard of the United States. Still, their shallow shelter held firm, and they were able to make much-needed repairs as the sea stirred in fury around them. When it finally subsided on the morning of the 15th, they were quick to sail back to their last known landmark at Sagadahoc Island, not realizing that their present position at Seal Island was in fact much closer to the Sagadahoc than it was to their destination. Thankfully, Popham's ship had caught wind of their error, and they sent out their shallop to deliver much-needed provisions. The following day, the boat returned, this time with orders to guide them to the river. The Marian John was at the edge of seaworthiness, its own shallop half sunk and damaged beyond use, but it plodded into the natural harbor soon enough and laid anchor next to the larger gift of God. The expedition had finally made it to the Sagadahoc nearly 3 full months after leaving England. And that was a problem in and of itself, as the summer was already coming to an end, and the 120-odd men enlisted by Sir John Popham were already low on supplies. They did have one advantage over the similarly ill-prepared Jamestown settlers 585 miles to their southwest, in that the majority of them were soldiers rather than gentlemen and servants, but they also faced an entirely different challenge. Maine gets very, very cold. It was the 17th of August, 1607, and while the Popham expedition had survived the journey across the Atlantic without any significant trouble, they still faced the daunting task of building a fort and gathering enough supplies to last them until planned supply missions would arrive in May of 1608. The colonists would have to survive the winter on their own, and there was no time to plant even the fastest growing crops. Cooperation or trade with the local Abenaki tribes could help, but to this point they hadn't had the best of luck in establishing friendships with those they'd encountered. The first step would be to determine where they should set up their initial fortifications, and from there to build a storehouse. To that end, Popham arranged for their shallops, Gilbert's having been hastily repaired, to sail up the river to see where they might find the most convenient place for their plantation. Popham's boat carried 30 men, while Gilbert brought 18 in his, and together they sailed about 42 miles upriver and thus into the vicinity of modern-day Augusta, which is now the capital of Maine. They encountered no natives during this trip, even when they put ashore to rest, though it's also possible that any who saw them would not have shown themselves out of pure caution. Davies describes the journey as pleasant, but Popham's decision to return to their beachhead that same night belies the old soldier's concern that they might not have been as safe as they appeared. Whatever the case, Popham opted to establish their fort at the mouth of the river, either for fear of the unknown dangers further north, or simply to remain close to the sea. Both bodies of water teemed with fish, and there was no time to plant crops, so this was a prudent choice for just about every conceivable reason. Leaning on his military experience, he selected a headland at the northern tip of the Saboninoa Peninsula, where any assault by land would face a 150-wide bottleneck that would be easily defensible by a line of musketeers and archers, even without further fortification. Amphibious assaults would be limited by the small size of the Abenaki canoes, which could be repelled by squads of just 8 to 10 men, as the English possessed superior arms and armor to any potential raiders. And that was an immediate concern, as 3 such canoes passed them by on the 18th as they worked to prepare their supplies. The building commenced 2 days later, the well-trained expeditionary force quickly digging trenches and palisades made of bundle sticks, which were referred to by a different name in the writing. The few trained carpenters amongst them had a different objective, that being the construction of a new ship, a 30-ton pinnace to be used as an exploratory vessel. Work went quickly on both the fortifications and the trip, and with all going according to plan, Captain Popham embarked on the first of their exploratory missions. He set off on the 22nd for the nearby Passamaquoddy River, noted by DaCosta as the archaic name for the Sheepscot River on the opposite side of Georgetown Island. His goal in doing so, if there was any in particular, was not mentioned. What Davies did record was the news gathered by the colony's president, which was that of war. The natives he had spoken to were engaged in conflict with a chief by the name of Saboninoa, and they had slain this man's son in a battle which also happened to involve Skidwaries and Nahanata, though it's unclear whose side they were on. Whatever the case, Popham returned the following day with this information. But Gilbert, not to be outdone by his elder rival, set off on the 25th for his own exploratory mission, this time heading west. Unfortunately for the younger man, the winds were not in his favor, and he was forced to turn back the very same afternoon, having achieved nothing of any significance whatsoever. He made a second attempt a few days later on the 28th, this time with Davies along for the ride. The two were joined by 13 other men, and according to the author, they sailed by many gallant islands until the wind once again turned against them and forced them ashore at Cape Elizabeth, 21 miles to the southwest. Davies and Gilbert found this to be an even more preferable place for a settlement, with tall hardwood trees and a stream, but not yet satisfied, Gilbert pushed his luck further to the west, though he made it only 6 miles due to the prevailing winds against him. It's crazy, it's almost like the weather itself was foreshadowing here. Anyway, recognizing that they lacked the ability to continue onwards, Gilbert turned back and sailed with the wind to the Sagadahoc, arriving the following afternoon. The 1st of September saw their first encounter with the local natives, who approached in canoes looking to trade from 2 great kettles of brass, which they had likely obtained from the French and which did not interest the English very much. Still, they took the opportunity to speak with their new acquaintances, though the Abenaki would only approach them one at a time. Their appearance was something that the English simply wouldn't value, might have even been something of a ruse, or a method of gaining intelligence perhaps, as Skidwaries and Nahanata appeared on the 5th, and they had not come alone. They rowed up in 9 canoes, carrying 40 people, and not just men, but women and children too. The colonists greeted them kindly, welcoming them into the fort and sharing what food they had to spare, though the purpose of this visit was elusive. Still, they were in no position to pass up the chance to forge a friendship with their neighbors, and in any case had no reason to cause them harm. Sometime during the afternoon, the majority of the Abenaki retreated across the river to camp, while Skidwaries and another man remained behind with the Englishmen. And as night fell in, Gilbert, Davies, and another man by the name of Ellis Best ferried them across the water to their kinsmen. In the morning, they departed back for their home on the Pemaquid, the meaning of their visit still unknown to Popham's men. It would seem, however, that the meaning was not unknown to Popham and Gilbert, who 2 days later loaded one of their ships with diverse merchandise for trade with Bothshabe, which sounds like the name of a Fall Out Boy song. And this man was identified as the chief commander in those parts, and they set off for the Penobscot River. Now here the account is very confusing because the author, who is either someone else or Davies suddenly referring to himself in the third person, starts to make conflicting remarks. On the one hand, he wrote that the wind was contrary against the Bothshabe, so that he could not come to Nahanata and Skidwaries at the time appointed, for it was the 11th day before he could get to the river of Pemaquid, where they do make their abode. On the other hand, he also records that Friday the 11th, in the morning early, we came into the river of Pemaquid, there to call on Nahanata and Skidwaries, as we had promised them. But being there arrived, we found no living creature. Something must be wrong here, because the author identifies the 11th as the day both parties arrived, yet also plainly says that the English found the village deserted. The account continues in a way that matches more with the latter story, and suggests that the English believed the absence of the Abenaki was the result of some miscommunication. Having planned to meet with this Bothshabe anyway, they proceeded northeast towards his domain along the Penobscot, where they presumed their friends were waiting for them. But unfortunately, Gilbert was not particularly familiar with the area, and did not enjoy studying his maps, so they spent the 12th and 13th of September sailing around trying to find the mouth of the river. Running out of supplies and utterly lost, they eventually turned back for the fort and arrived on the 15th. And that night, they witnessed a shooting star. A week passed without any significant developments. The fort was coming along well, and the storehouse was under construction, and Popham must have felt confident enough in their progress to spare Gilbert and 19 others for an expedition up the Sagadahoc. Either that, or Gilbert pressed the issue until he was allowed to go, in spite of the rapidly approaching winter season. Either way, the crew of 20 set off on the 23rd of September, sailing until nightfall and then doing the same on the 24th, until the skies darkened and they found a decent place to land. It was good land, and if they sailed the same distance each day as Popham's mission had a month prior, then they likely made it as far north as Norridgewock, which is nearly halfway to the Canadian border. The day after that, they proceeded another 8 leagues, or about 24 miles, up the river until they came to an island. Now, Davies' description of this island is actually remarkably similar to those given in the Norse sagas about the Vinland colony established 600 years prior to the Popham expedition. He wrote of a great store of grapes, good and sweet, of 2 sorts, both red, but one of them a marvelous deep red. And these grew not only on the island, but on both sides of the river as well, along with hops, a small sort of onion, and wild garlic. As for the location of the island, which Davies referred to as being low and flat, it was downriver of a great downfall of water, which runneth by both sides of the island, very swift and shallow. And assuming that they did not accidentally turn west and follow the Carabasset River, then this is likely a description of Caratunk Falls, which is outside of Solon, Maine. Considering that the Carabasset has a series of rather non-negotiable rapids under a mile from its confluence with the Kennebec, which is the modern name for the Sagadahoc, it's unlikely that they went that way. Still, if it was Caratunk Falls, then it seems that they were able to scale the waterfall, pulling the boat up the obstacle using ropes and pure manpower. And from there, they traveled yet another league upriver before finally setting in for the evening. And that night, the Abenaki came. It was near 10 o'clock when Gilbert and his men spotted them in the darkness across the river. The Kennebec is only 500 feet across at the point where they were encamped, and the broken English passed easily enough over the shallow water. What the natives said has been lost to history, as has the response from the Englishmen. In fact, the remainder of Davies' journal, if it ever continued at all, seems to have disappeared from the record as well. The gap is filled in by Strachey's work, which is reliable enough, and picks up where Davies left off, that being the morning of the 26th of September, when a canoe approached from the far side of the river. In it were 4 natives, the chief among them calling himself Saboninoa, and he proclaimed to them that he was lord of the river Sagadahoc. By the time Saboninoa and his men had arrived that morning, the English were already back on the water and preparing to set off for the next leg of their journey. However, given that their mission was to establish a successful colony, they couldn't pass up the opportunity to make an ally out of a man powerful enough to call himself lord of so great a river, or to learn what sort of threats might await them from the tribes to the north. To that end, they invited him onto their shallop, and he graciously accepted the invitation under the condition that one of Gilbert's men be given over as a hostage to wait in the canoe. His people, after all, were not so far from the coast that word would not have spread of Weymouth's abductions 2 years prior. Gilbert, proud as he was not a stupid man, and intended no harm against the chief, so he agreed to the exchange. With that, Saboninoa climbed into the shallop, where he graciously accepted some trifling things, and then, in an instant, everything about the encounter went sideways. As quickly as the canoe had appeared, it set off again upriver, with Gilbert's man still held captive by the remaining 3 Abenaki. Saboninoa rushed for the gunwale to leap overboard, only to be restrained by the English and forced back to the center of the deck. The colonists then rushed to the oars and followed the natives upriver until they came to a second waterfall, this one so shallow and swift that by no means could they pass any further, and there they pulled ashore and landed with 9 men, and of course, Gilbert. They took Saboninoa with them, demanding that he tell them where his companions had taken their comrade, and the chief replied that his village was some 3 miles inland, and without much choice in the matter, he guided them towards it. The march to the village was reportedly tedious, but Saboninoa had not lied about their destination, and soon enough they came to a decently sized settlement hidden within the dense woodland. And it was a good thing that they had a hostage, because they were met by 50 bowmen, of exceptional height and build no less, wearing fresh war paint and screaming for a fight. This was, however, not Gilbert's first rodeo with such a show of force, and he stood his ground. Whatever his intentions had been, Saboninoa seemed to recognize that the tables had turned against him, and instead chose the path of diplomacy. He ordered his men to put down their weapons and return their captive, and with the danger having passed, at least for the moment, the 2 sides cautiously came together to discuss trade opportunities. What happened next was most likely a result of benign cultural ignorance, but no less catastrophic for its lack of malice. Gilbert's men had brought glass beads, steel knives, and copper wares with them as trade goods, and they presented these to Saboninoa and his people as a demonstration of what they had to sell. The English expressed their desire for the Abenaki to come back to the river so that they could exchange goods in greater amounts, and for all they could tell, their new partners understood this request. Gilbert returned to the shallop, moored across the river, to await their arrival, and shortly thereafter Saboninoa's men arrived with a small amount of tobacco and several pelts, which the English perceived to be of no real value. Believing that the Abenaki had nothing worthwhile to trade, such as gold, full-size furs, or at the very least food, Gilbert ordered his men to pack up and head back downriver. What he didn't understand was that Saboninoa had not brought these items for trade, but rather as gifts, and by declining to accept them, Gilbert hadn't just said no to what he thought was a bad deal. He had committed a grave insult. The situation deteriorated rapidly, explains historian Christopher Bilodeau, as one Indian attempted to disarm the English by dousing the torch on the shallop they used to light their matchlocks. The man apparently asked to use the lit firebrand to ignite his tobacco pipe, only to throw it into the water and then leap into the river after it. Now, whatever the intentions of the Abenaki were here, the English reasonably perceived this attempt to disarm them as a threat, and Gilbert ordered his men to arm themselves with sword and shield in order to make a push towards the still smoldering campfire. The Abenaki, for their part, perceived that the English meant to light a torch to replace their firebrand, so as one of the soldiers ran for the fire, and I am quoting Davies here, the savages resisted him and would not suffer him to take any. Although, guys, I guess I'm technically quoting Strachey, paraphrasing Davies. Not really the point. Their companions, meanwhile, held on to the ropes of the shallop in order to prevent it from putting off. Knowing that they outclassed the natives in weapons and armor, the English pressed their advantage as Gilbert ordered his men still armed with muskets to present their weapons. The Abenaki, potentially due to uncertainty regarding precisely how those weapons functioned, immediately drew back, taking their bows and arrows and retreating into the bushes. The 2 sides took aim at one another, each waiting for the other to take the first shot, and for a tense moment it seemed as though this diplomatic incident might turn into a bloody skirmish. But neither company was willing to ignite the struggle, and as the last of the English swordsmen climbed aboard the shallop, the vessel cast off from the shoreline and into the safety of the river. Gilbert's men narrowly escaped violence, and Saboninoa's men must also have realized that it had all been a misunderstanding. They had just come ashore a little ways down the river when another canoe approached them without any weapons visible, and the men aboard communicated an apology for their actions of their kinsmen, which Gilbert graciously accepted, but he remained wary nonetheless. Once the natives had gone, he and his men sailed back to where they had spent the previous night, where they erected a cross before heading home via the Sagadahoc River and arriving on the 29th. Now, in their absence, George Popham seemed to have been busy. Gilbert and his men had been back at the fort for less than a week when, on October 3rd, a canoe arrived carrying a familiar native face. It was Skidwary's, who asked that the colonists inform their president that Nahanada, another Sagamo named Amenquin, and the brother of the Bashabe, who is as of yet still unnamed, intended to cross the river the next day to visit them. Colonists prepared for their august guests as best they could, and on the 4th, 2 canoes crossed the water to be received with a modest feast. You see, George Popham was a wiser man than Raleigh Gilbert, and much milder in temperament. Where Gilbert preferred shows of force and daring escapades, the president of the colony understood that they needed the natives to like and respect them, not just fear them. Even if they didn't need help learning to survive in this new place, the sheer numerical superiority of the Abenaki meant that offending them could mean death, or at the very least, the forced abandonment of their fledgling fortress. To that end, Popham sought to undo whatever damage his subordinate had done in his dealings with the local tribes, and this was an important first step toward succeeding in that mission. The feast appeared to be a success, and the Sagamore Membertou remained behind to act as an emissary and guide for the colonists, while Popham provided his departing guests with gifts of beads, copper, and knives. He also shrewdly sent along gifts to be presented to the Bishabe himself, as well as for his wife, giving him to understand that he would come onto his court in the River Penobscot and see him very shortly, bringing many such like of his country's commodities with him. This was a step in the right direction, but beneath the push for greater cooperation with the natives lay a sense of desperation. As Popham worked to establish security at the mouth of the Sagadahoc, he simultaneously sought aid from overseas. Winter was coming on quickly, and seeing the writing on the wall, he had sent the Mary and John back to England both to report on their situation and plead for more supplies. But also aboard that ship were rumors of trouble in the colony, carried by Captain Robert Davies, who is not to be confused with Captain James Davies, to whom he may or may not have been related. While no record from the settlement itself survives to that effect, another of the settlement's financiers by the name of Sir Fernando Gorges, or Gorget, must have received bad enough news for him to write a letter describing how childish factions, ignorant, timid, and ambitious persons have bred an unstable resolution and a general confusion in all their affairs, which it just bars. According to Bilodeau, Gorget had little faith in both leaders, and described Popham as an honest man, but old and of an unwieldy body, and timidly fearful to offend or contest with others that will or do oppose him. Chief in Gorget's mind was Raleigh Gilbert himself, to whom the financier referred as humorous and headstrong, but also of small judgment and experience. More damningly, he accused the younger man of being desirous of supremacy in rule and prompt to sensuality, with little zeal in religion. In short, he was not the kind of man Gorget wanted in charge of his investment, and the knight feared that should Popham die or be deposed, Gilbert would be the man to take command in Maine. This was a real possibility, as, unbeknownst to the colonists, Sir John Popham passed away shortly after the expedition made it to the New World. Without his continued patronage, those loyal to George Popham stood little chance of obtaining support against Gilbert should something happen. Gorget was right to fear such an eventuality, as winter came on strong that year. In London, the Thames froze so deeply that it allowed shipbuilders to construct their boats on top of the ice, and in New England the situation was no different. And in due time, the Sagadahoc too froze over, severely limiting the mobility of the colonists even if they could manage to secure food supplies from their Abenaki neighbors. This lack of supplies led Popham to make the difficult decision to send about half of the colony's men back to England aboard the Gift of God, probably captained by James Davies, in early December. And even then, they were unable to provide the ship with enough supplies for the whole voyage, and so they were forced to send along what trade goods they could spare so that the ship could sell them in the Azores before continuing to their destination. Still, Popham believed their mission was possible if King James I could be persuaded to personally support the effort. He wrote a letter, which in truth probably wasn't even embellished, describing the surrounding area as ripe with resources and goods which rivaled those coming out of the Spanish-controlled Indies. He also appealed to his king's graciousness and glory, and wrote that the natives would gladly accept him as an overlord once they learned of his power and generosity, and that even then, his wonderful sense of justice and scarcely credible constancy brought great happiness to the natives of the provinces. And that part probably was embellished. Popham, for any of his flaws, was an intelligent and diplomatic leader who knew how to flatter kings, and under his command, the colony might have managed to take root, but in February, tragedy dashed any such hopes. On February 8, 1608, George Popham was found dead. The exact causes of his demise remain unknown, and while treachery on the part of Gilbert can't be ruled out, there were a number of other possibilities that just as easily could have brought him to his end. Cold, hunger, and disease were all on the table, and without any documentation from the colony, it's impossible to say for sure what killed him. Whatever the case, Raleigh Gilbert assumed command of the colony, with all others capable of claiming that authority already back in England. Unfortunately, what we know of the colony's remaining days is very limited. We do know that Captain Robert Davies returned to the colony with 2 ships in May of 1608, and for the first time, those outside of Maine learned of the death of George Popham and several others, all of them apparently by unknown circumstances. This was not the only trouble, as Gilbert's quarters and several other buildings, possibly even the storehouse, had burned down over the winter, but the colony wasn't lost yet. Davies found that the grounds of the fort were well developed and that the colonists were nearing completion of the Virginia, soon to be the first British-built ocean-going vessel in the New World. Most importantly, the remaining 50 or so colonists had survived the winter, and while there were rumors of conflict with the Abenaki, no written accounts of significant violence have survived to the present day. Accounts from the oral traditions of the local natives are a little bit inconsistent, and while some describe outright violence on both sides, it's possible that these are exaggerations and that conflict was largely limited to standoffs like those Gilbert encountered in his first months after their arrival. If there was violence, then it seems likely that Gilbert's lack of diplomatic talents and his penchant for finding ways to turn otherwise friendly encounters into contentious situations were to blame. You see, the end of the adventure was not brought about by native raids, colonial infighting, or even a lack of supplies. By the time the Mary and John returned with a load of supplies in September, the fort was finished, the Virginia was seaworthy, and the situation was at least considerably better than the utter disaster simultaneously occurring at Jamestown. While they hadn't managed to cultivate any crops yet, they had the facilities to store plenty of grain shipped in from England, game was abundant, and there were quite literally plenty of fish in the sea. All of this is to say that the settlement was, so far as the historical record shows, pretty well on its way to success. The only thing they needed at that point, if they were to become a self-sustaining colony, was more colonists. The problem was, as it had always been, Raleigh Gilbert. As it happened, Gilbert's reasons for undertaking this expedition were partially due to his standing as the second son of a knightly house. His secondary position in his father's lineage meant he inherited the dignity of his family's name, but nothing else. Upon his father's death, the Gilbert family's holdings had passed to his elder brother, Sir John Gilbert, and this had left Raleigh without any significant fortune or a landed inheritance. He had believed that joining up with the Sagadahoc colony granted him the best chance to gain lands and wealth of his own, and he likely maintained that belief until the return of the Mary and John in September of 1608. Unfortunately for the colony, the ship's crew hadn't just brought supplies with them. They had brought news as well. Sir John Gilbert was dead, and everything he owned now fell into the hands of his younger brother. Raleigh Gilbert at this point learned that he was now the owner of a not insignificant estate in England, where he could live the comfortable life of a gentleman in a place where his name alone commanded respect, and more importantly, where each passing day wasn't fraught with every sort of danger imaginable. There was no good reason for him to stay in the New World, aside from the potential for leaving his mark on English history, but that alone was not enough to keep him from returning to England to rejoin polite society. This, in turn, left a power vacuum at the fort, and one that no man was particularly eager to fill. Fort St. George, as they had named their settlement, was in no immediate danger, but since taking command, Gilbert had torpedoed relations with the Abenaki, failed to inspire confidence in his subordinates, and neglected to make any progress in expanding their position. The few gentlemen who accompanied him had little interest in assuming his position, and without the pressure from their chief financier, who was dead, there was nothing keeping them from packing up and sailing back to England. So it was that the remaining members of the Popham colony gathered what supplies they had, outfitted the Virginia for her maiden voyage, and put her to sea alongside the Mary and John. In the end, it was no outside circumstance that led them to give up on the first settlement in New England, but rather the impressively poor leadership of Raleigh Gilbert. And because of his inadequacy, the first people to settle New England were not soldiers or adventurers, but the religious fanatics known as the Puritans, who saw America not as a land of opportunity, but of escape from the burgeoning civic and religious liberties of 17th century England. So, one must weep in imagining how different things might have been if only a better man than Raleigh Gilbert had been in command of the colony on the Sagadahoc. Now, of course, I can't mention the Puritans without mentioning witch trials, but I've been holding off on doing a witch trials video because it's a more history-heavy topic, but if you guys are interested in that, just comment Salem, in the comments. I know this was a very history-heavy video, and sometimes that's not the audience's favorite, but I had a lot of fun researching it, and I hope that you guys enjoyed it as a story. Gave me a lot of thoughts for, I feel like this would be a great movie. Maybe Aiden and I will try and write a script for it, see what we can do. Because really, I had no idea this story existed until earlier this week. And I went through and read it, and I was like, this would be an amazing movie. So if you would like to support us as we try and turn stories from history into stories on the screen, I mean, we're currently doing that, but we're also trying to do that with bigger screens. Aiden just bought a really expensive camera and he still hasn't insured it. Anyway, you can support us by subscribing to us on Patreon for just $1 a month, where we are working to start adding, I think, ad-free videos. Correct, Aiden?
That's the goal.
That's the goal. We just have to get some other things on track. We need employees. And here's the thing, you can help us to hire those employees by subscribing on Patreon. You can also help us by checking out our coffee from Tableau Roasting Company. That is Mount Pocono Perk. It is a delicious blend that I designed myself, and I know what I'm doing, take my word for it. You can also check out our merch over at Bunker Branding. It is very cozy, very soft. We have t-shirts and we have hoodies. I should also tell you that the best way to get updates and engage with our community is through our Discord server at bit.ly/jointhelodge. And yes, we do pop in there now and then to dialogue with you. If you're looking for more Lodge, you can get it, and if you really enjoyed the history aspect, you should check out History Unhinged. That is the channel that we have with Stakuyi, where it's what the title says. We also have the Weird Bible channel, which has a podcast that we do with Wendigoon that we are trying to schedule more episodes of, and I'm also working on adding another show to that channel that will be a little bit more, a little bit more academic, but hopefully also really fun. I'm going to take an Anglican priest, a Catholic priest, and an Orthodox priest, and I'm going to ask them questions of contention. I'm going to call it the Nicene Crowd. We also have our live show, the Lore Lads, which goes live on Monday nights at 7 p.m. here on YouTube, and if it doesn't, then we'll tell you. You can also catch that show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all the other podcasting services 2 days after it goes live on YouTube, and that would be Wednesday morning. And we are also working on getting episodes of the video essays. We're getting those uploaded as well. So if you want to go check us out on Spotify, it would really help. I think that's just about everything. I know this needs to go on a little long so we can get in all of the Patreon subs that flash on the screen, because those we love all of you, but we love them more. Your donation is a direct manifestation of your love for us. No, but in all seriousness, thank you guys so much, those of you who contribute via Patreon or just contribute by watching the videos. You help us do what we love. This is our dream job, so thank you so much. Also, real quick, sorry, had to shoot this on a different day. Things are crazy at the Lodge. Don't forget to click the link in the description to get our special discount on CyberGhost VPN. CyberGhost VPN protects your data while you browse, and it gives you access to region-blocked content on the internet for just $2.03 a month. It's totally risk-free, so give it a try at the link in the description. And with all of that said, I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.